All right, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. We're going to cover the latest and greatest on Sprint 22 today. So we're going to start off with some updates from both the checkout experience and then some of the work that James and the team have been doing on some of the development operations as well. In addition to that, we're going to cover some development documentation as well. So Sami is sitting in for us, and we're going to continue to show some progress on the Venya Global Styles project, which is helping helping everyone kind of learn the components of the pages that we continue to share and build out with the community with folks like Artem and others. So that's really the lineup for today. It should be a short one, again based on the capacity from this last sprint, but we want to keep with what we've got and then share with what we've got as well. So without further ado, let's start off with Jimmy here. He's going to show us some work on checkout as well as some of the extensibility work.
Thanks, Art. Let's give the sharing screen a shot. Okay. So I just put up a PR here for the work that we're going to be looking at today. So I'm covering a couple stories here. One of those is the refactor of the checkout actions and reducers to make those more ready for extensibility, and also adding a shipping address form to the checkout experience, which we're going to demo right now. So give me a second to rearrange my, there we go. Okay, so ordinarily on the checkout page, or ordinarily when you're going through checkout, you enter the page, you need to do some kind of initial requests to get a guest cart or load it from local storage if one already exists on your browser. We need to make sure the checkout is in the right state since you've reset. And then we need to get the details of that cart. And so you see that whenever you refresh the page, you're going to see these requests that go off. One is to guest carts, the other is totals. This is how it works on master today. But these requests have been changed a bit, and we'll walk through that in the code in a bit. And so we have an empty guest cart at the moment. We're going to add some items. Okay, so now we have, notice that all of the Redux actions, which are being spit out here in the console as we go through this is what we're paying attention to down here. These are now prefixed by their area or domain within Redux. So toggle drawer is an app action, it'll be prefixed as app. Cart actions will be prefixed with cart, etc. So we've added some items. We can see the GraphQL and REST calls coming in here. We're going to go to checkout. That is going to pop up our overview here. And this is where we have more actions coming in here to submit the cart for checkout. And now we're going to edit this section. So now we've got a form. We'll walk through this in the code in a little bit here, but basically we have form fields, and they are part of a form which can be submitted. And so we're going to enter our sample data. Let's go figure out what her zip was.
49628-79.
I've got it, thank you. And then
You've clearly done a lot of prototyping lately to know that by heart.
Oh,
so.
You might say that. And then this is entered.
It's ronniecost@example.com. Doesn't matter.
Wow. There we go. And so if we look here what that kicked off, we submitted an address form here with some form values from those fields that we just entered. And then that kicked off a request to the shipping information endpoint with that address information that had been actually fortified, with some country and region data, because we fetched countries from the directory and got those things. And then it was accepted. So this is kind of a pattern that we'll see after this refactor, right, where we have a submit, the request goes off, and then if it comes back, we'll get the accept version of that action. And if it 400s or 500s, we'll get a reject for that. And then once we've sent that off, since the response that we get from the server is not particularly useful, we update the cart again. And so now, if we were to dive back in here, we'll have the correct information. If we enter some stuff in here, right, and then cancel, it's temporary, so it's not going to be saved. But we are good to go. And so now we can place order. And we're good. So to walk through real quick what we're looking at here, here's the address form. This is what it looks right now because we have not written abstractions for this, so it's just plain old containers, labels, text fields. There are other inputs available. The inputs here are coming from the successor to React form, which is called informed. We have inputs here: text, text area, radio, checkbox, select, and multi-select. And forms are a higher order component, which you can pass children as props to. There's lots of options, lots of documentation. And checkout flow remains largely the same. There's a flow component, which renders a form if we're on the checkout form section. And then if we're editing the address, it'll render the address. So we'll follow the same pattern when we get to billing information and shipping method, etc. And then to take a look real quick at the way the actions and reducers have been refactored, let's dive into checkout or cart. So inside the cart where we're defining actions, this is effectively events, right? So here's the namespace for them. And now we just have a big list of all the plain sort of events or actions associated with the cart. We use this create actions function here to make functions for all of them that will automatically create action payloads. You just give it type. And that's the default export coming out of an actions file. And then we have a bunch of async action creators. These are the orchestrators. Things that like make API requests or call sequences of actions. And so for each of these things, we have a general pattern of taking in a payload from the call site, maybe doing some work, and then we return the thunk, same as before, which can do the orchestration. Here we make a request, await it, and then dispatch its result, or if there was an error during the request, catch the error and dispatch the same action with the error. What we can do, because of the way we've created these actions, is we can say dispatch actions.add item. This one is coming automatically from here. So when we create these actions, it generates functions that we can automatically call, and those things are named so that when we come over to the reducer, we can literally just import them up here, import actions, and then we can define our map of reducers, and put those functions in as the action type that we want to handle. And so now this reducer file is totally isolated from whatever those actions might be exactly named. And these will be much easier to refactor in the future. They'll be much clearer to document in the future. They all follow the same pattern. So if we dive into checkout, we'll see the same thing. We can even further subdivide actions into basically subdomains. So here we're handling what we do when input's submitted, what we do when it's accepted, what we do when it's rejected, etc. So a lot of things have been unified, a lot of things have been streamlined. Boilerplate should be easier to follow. So check it out. And I think that's it. Let's switch to someone else.
And it is fantastic.
Yeah, Jimmy, that's great.
This is a great streamlining. I'm really happy with this, and it sort of makes me excited for how much more sort of liberating the source code is going to feel when there's the boilerplate that exists makes sense, and the boilerplate that isn't clarifying goes away. So thank you for continuing to iterate on that very, very much.
No, absolutely. Still work to do, so please take a look.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Yeah, I'm taking a look at the board right now. I think this really closes what we've got on the MVP. So I think that was the last remaining portion of that on the editable shipping. I think shipping, obviously, I think is in good shape. And then you showed a little bit there on extensibility. So I think really, really good sprint for you. So I'll go ahead and close those out for that. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, let's switch gears. So we can go either go on the global styles with Samia covering for Mr. Kalkaben, or James, if you'd like to go. We've got some CI work and others as well. So
We got CI work. We have the sort of a number of pull requests that I made to kind of improve the internal processes that were part of the Epic we opened and that we sort of opportunistically put stuff in the backlog for. So I kind of went commando on that. And then there's also sort of the beginnings of a specification for middle tier architecture, which I'd like to share. Ready to do that. Samia, would you like to go or would you like to wait?
I'm happy to go.
yeah, let's do Samia first. I think that's a quick one, and then we'll use the remaining time. I think James, you've got some good things to share. So
All right.
Right. Can you see? Yes, we can see. Great. All right, so I am standing in for Mr. Jimothy, aka James Kalkaben, on docs. So what we've tried to do is to provide some global guidelines for component work that community developers or whoever it is that's building out Venia components or just components can follow. This is Venia specific. And so how we've tried to organize this is going sort of outwards in, so starting with layout, grid specifications, things like borders and so on, border radius and width, adding helpful notes where it is needed or could be useful, layers, and then color properties, on which we've had some feedback from the community, and we've addressed that feedback, followed by typography. We've tried to provide links to the open source sort of resources we are using in Venia wherever applicable, whether that's fonts or icons. And then also the fallback for if you're not using the one in Venia, what needs to happen, relative text or typographic size specifications, a sample to show, how many weight variations we recommend using and which ones, how to deal with animations and easing, and then the icon library that we're currently using, and that's it. So next steps on this is we currently have some external developers as part of Magento U in this office. I'm working with Kalkaben to define some tasks from a usability standpoint that we can test with, and then start getting feedback, more focused feedback on the doc side and these individual pieces, and we will continue to refine this. Any questions?
I think it looks awesome. I appreciate that. Recently, I think there was a dispute about how many font weights there should be. Is that right, Jimmy?
I mean, we'd had some discussion with Brendan Falkowski about it.
Yes.
He raised some good points there. So
Yes. Well, I think it looks wonderful. Thank you very much.
On behalf of Jimothy, thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're in his stead, so you have to accept that thanks.
All right, I'm
You
taking it.
You have to accept my gratitude.
I've accepted it.
I think it's great. We'll close this one out. We actually did that one on Friday because James would give me a preview of that. So I think that's going to go a long way towards consistency and some of the finer details on the theme. So thank you.
Yes. Sure.
Awesome.
Excellent. All right, Mr. Zetlin.
I'll start with sharing the. Well, first of all, I'll start with sharing my screen, and then I will begin by sharing the CI work and the open pull request that I think is going to be the biggest. Just share the whole screen. Great. This is the pull request that I think is going to make the biggest difference for everybody. You might see that in the Slack channels and the tweets and in some of the GitHub issues, some of the most common problems that people encounter are that the PWA dev server part of build pack, which just comes right out of the box, totally pre-configured with Venia, and is also part of the instruction set that we put out for build pack. It tries to do a couple of things, which it's not super great at on everybody's platforms. It tries to provision an SSL certificate and assumes that OpenSSL exists in a certain way, and it tries to edit your host file, which is the most cross-platform way of providing a unique domain. And providing a unique domain, incidentally, is just mostly in order for people to work on multiple PWAs simultaneously without overriding their own service workers, which is a use case that, as it turns out, was probably not the best thing to focus on for MVP. It's an important use case, and the code is still useful and important, but making it optional is the right way. And so that's sort of the course correction that we've done. And in this pull request, not only do we make those things optional and turned off by default, but we also have a much more consistent. Okay, let me see if there's some README stuff. We have much more consistent documentation regarding it, and I'm not sure if that's going to be cool. Yeah, we have a much better configuration documentation for it, and it works a lot better. It does a very simple thing where it will create a unique domain if you wanted to, based on the file system path of your PWA Studio directory, and that befits the sort of work style of people that we've seen work, and is a lot less ambitious than what we were trying to do before, and relies a lot less on a local database. Again, it's all very deeply documented. It doesn't show up perfectly in this README because when it's published to DevDocs, it looks a lot better. But until this is merged, it won't be published to DevDocs, so there you have it. We're a little in the way of demo for this, mostly because it's meant to resolve bugs that occur on other people's machines. But I think it's important to point out that we have it's an iterative process of moving away from early mistakes or early, over-ambitious choices, and that we're going to continue to do that. So that's an important thing. And I think now is the right time to transition to the specification that I've written, Unified PWA Definitions of Graphs, which is a declarative specification. So what it is it's Unified PWA Definitions of Graphs. Is this going to be distracting? Because it's also could be called Upward. I have a branch where it's less distractingly named, and we can do that.
I totally thought he did a Bugs Bunny thing and said, "What's up, dog?" And I'm like, "Oh, up dog. Okay, yeah. I get it."
What is up dog? Yeah, it's about a henway. What this repository will ultimately be is a test suite, which is something that other specifications like Mustache and GraphQL are implemented that way. Basically, it's something that you can run against a server that you make to make sure that it adheres to a specification. Let's talk about that specification and the rationale for it. An Upward file is a YAML file. Maybe later we'll add XML capability to it for the people who are the most familiar with it, but it is a completely declarative description of how an application shell server should function. An app shell is very minimal, and this is an idea which has been done before. Declarative service orchestration is something that's there's hundreds of papers on in computer science. I actually referenced them, I think, in this. But with progressive web apps, there is a strict subset of all the things that HTTP can do that we really want to do and that we want to be responsible for. And because of that strict subset, we're not doing state management. We're not handling a lot of HTTP verbs. Anything that would change state is something we pass through to another API, so the server wouldn't handle it. It gets small enough, and the set of behaviors that we want to enable gets strict enough that a specification language becomes a real possibility with that sort of descending into rewriting a programming language in XML. There's a single branch structure in this that is pattern matching, which is a proven technique that is very maintainable and also very mergeable. And the rest of it is all just sort of processes described that assemble an application shell from a backend graph of data. So the idea here is that you can assemble responses based on just simply populating a big fat context object with things. For instance, in this declaration file that's up here, there is a request object which begins the cycle and is always present. And because this doesn't do anything but add a status value to the context and some headers and a body, it's not going to add anything else or receive anything else from the context beside what's built in. And so there is a mustache template that renders what's available in that request object, which is, of course, the usual things, HTTP version. It iterates over header entries to get to all of the headers that came back, protocol, host, hostname, port, and path name. I have an implementation of this that is running fairly well and passing tests with a few snapshots here that are present to demonstrate. The configuration file is supposed to be the only thing that a server needs, and it may refer to other local files. So ultimately, you may produce a folder with some GraphQL queries in it, and those queries would be referenced in a more complex example. Here we see the branch logic. There's a particular type of action or response layer called a when, and the when has a match clause, which specifies a deep match for the context object. So if there's a status, it will do a regular expression against that status. These are cross-platform regular expressions that should be implemented in xregex, which is available in all languages. And upon matching, there is a respond clause, which is another node which implements a response plan. So in this case, we have a conditional clause, which is going to end up putting monkey see in the status rather than monkey do, because the status turns out to be 403. One of these servers is supposed to detect topological dependencies. So since this thing checks on the status, then it has to wait to execute until the status is available. So rather than having to do a lot of after and before specification or make sure that you're parallelizing things, it parallelizes everything by default. A collection of these rules is going to run in as much concurrency as the platform will permit. That's up to the implementation. And if you need to do something in series, it's going to emerge naturally because of the dependencies that you write. And we can see a more complex example of that in actually how you put together a Magento application shell. Great thing about YAML is that it has anchors, much like XML refs. So this is completely unread by the system. All that it cares about is the root property. And it just is a reusable block of here's how to do it 404. So this specifies that when the URL matches anything.html, then it's likely to be an SEO-friendly URL. So in order to resolve it, we have to do these things. First of all, we have to get the general store data. This is a GraphQL query, and it can be cached, and the caching is not the responsibility of the server. That happens in parallel, and simultaneously, a request goes to the URL resolver. You'll notice that we're passing something to the request. This is something that's part of our context. The URL is just part of the context object that we're assembling. So we pass it in as a variable, and then we specify an after manually in this example, because this example was written prior to topological sorting. But after the URL resolver is complete, then we can go through a conditional match on what the URL resolver type returned. If it's a product, we call with the product detail GraphQL query. If it's a category, we call it the category. And if it's a CMS page, we call it the CMS page. And as we get more and more types out of the URL resolver, then this switch statement would expand linearly. And then there's a fallback position where if none of those things match, then you can respond with the not found template, and it's reused up here. So specifications scare people, and they can seem architecture astronautics. So I tried to go to the trouble of explaining why this is necessary based on 12-factor principles and starting from there. A progressive web app is a strange thing because a web app historically cannot function without backing services. So it's really only part of an application. It has to be on the network. And a progressive web app has this new thing called offline mode, where it has to run as much as possible without any backing services of any kind. So there's this coupling that exists even in a 12-factor app, and this diagram is actually taken from 12factor.net, where the production deploy has orchestrated URLs to services, and that's a nice bit of decoupling, but it still requires that these 4 services with these roles be there. The great thing about a 12-factor is that if you want to swap out the MySQL implementation with another server, you can, but this is still something that kind of ad hoc depends on this broad graph of services. So the idea of Upward is to formalize that graph into pure GraphQL. If necessary, you implement GraphQL wrappers outside of the specified server on top of the services that you need. And you end up with a pure graph and a single set of endpoints so that GraphQL is the only necessary network operation that you need to do. And once you've done that, then you actually have a specification that you can package with the progressive web app so that the PWA can declare what kind of application shell it needs independent of the service architecture. For some reason, this thing isn't resolving, but the idea of service orchestration is common, but this is really more of a service choreography concept, which is sort of a new idea. But in service orchestration, there is a notion of the orchestrator as an object with a particular perspective. Service choreography is a notion where you have a global perspective, which is what these files specify. Is everyone still awake?
Yeah, I have a question, real quick on the on converting these connections to GraphQL queries. How does authentication work? So, like, how do you pass credentials?
Delegated down to the implementation. So for the REST APIs, for instance, since there's 3 kinds of authentication, right? There's OAuth bearer token authentication, there's login-based authentication, and then there's a third one. I think is it admin or is it just guest? In either case, when you're implementing a GraphQL wrapper over REST, such as with Apollo Server, there are a whole lot of connectors that come out of the box that allow you to configure how you pass that authentication along. Much in the way that Varnish and EdgeSide includes pass your session along to the other URLs that it calls, this would do the same thing. So as a individual loading up the progressive web app, my session would be passed to these various services. It's not up to the implementer of the underlying Magento GraphQL to make everything GraphQL before this comes out the gate. This is supposed to be part of a network topology, so it's up to the implementer who wants to put GraphQL on top of store config, for instance.
Okay, makes sense.
Sure. That's what I got. Again, it's a specification in progress, and what's the appearance of this specification should motivate is an implementation of PHP, which I wanted to try. I think that kind of was out of scope, but I wanted to kind of demonstrate that it was pretty easy to do. The things that are necessary and supported, which are just adding, calling, and doing branch logic, those are all things that I found PHP libraries to do. It's really, really simple to assemble these pieces of functionality in PHP. You just have to know more about Composer and its lifecycle to quickly set it up than I do. So I'm hoping that this enables people to make web servers that do the exact same thing in development and in production on Node and on PHP or on Python or on Ruby or in Cloud or wherever you want to do it. And that's going to help us to be more 12-factor clean and help us to have a more reliable architecture and a cheaper architecture that doesn't rely on as much at runtime. I think it's a great first step. Questions?
Don't have questions, but it looks awesome to me.
Yeah, I think it's great. I know we're working on some discovery work for middle tier. I think this is a big first step of this. I'd love to continue getting some feedback from the community, especially as we post this out. But I think this solves a lot of those, those modularity, extensibility questions that we have, especially with this approach. So thank you. This is great.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess that concludes my part of the demo, although I think it would be cool to observe that we've started reporting our tests as JUnit XML into Circle CI, which we weren't doing before. We were running our tests inside the danger file, and that's an implementation detail. What it means is that there was only one system that understood how well we were passing our tests, and it wasn't reporting over time. But Circle CI now understands our test output and can give us, as we get more and more successful builds and masters, some really great insight into how much we're gaining on code coverage and quality. And these are graphs that we can show.
That's great.
All right.
As a product person, I appreciate good graphs. So.
Oh, yeah.
Is this right? I know at one point we're going back and forth on versioning for Circle CI. Have we made the jump to the latest?
Oh, we did that with
As
the
well.
Monterey.
Yeah.
We're no longer concerned about that. I think one concern we have is making sure that our integrations are low in terms of security risk, because we do actually pass our auth tokens to people who fork pull requests. And that's an interesting, weird thing. But that's a little out of scope for the demo as well.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Any other questions between what James shared and then everything else that we covered as well? So. Okay, very good. So just cleaning up the sprint that we have here, I think we've done quite a bit here, as you've seen in Sprint 22. I mean, I would consider everything that we've got here essentially closed. I was closing this throughout from this, and so thank you again for everybody's attendance, everybody's work. I know it was a bit of a difficult week in terms of availability, but I think we got a lot done in a relatively short amount of time. So if anybody has any questions, let us know. We'll go ahead and post this out to the usual channels, but looking forward to everybody's help, and then kicking off Sprint 23 later today. So.
Yeah, for public consumption, I just want to say, if you're watching this all the way to the end, thank you, and come to the demos. Show up in Slack, at me, please at me, unless I say don't at me specifically, because the more people talking to us, the better about these decisions. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Everyone.